Merry Meet, Annie here. Welcome back to Tarot Together. This video is about the Waite-Smith tarot deck itself, because it's the one that I'll be sharing when I share my interpretation of the history and symbols and meaning of the various cards. And a lot of you have a Waite-Smith deck, but even if we have a deck, we might not have the same deck. So I wanted to go into a little bit about the history of the cards and mention some of the difference in it. Now, I don't collect a bunch of different tarot decks myself. I'm all about the Waite-Smith deck, but I do like to collect different versions of it and also some of the clone versions of it. The deck was first published in 1909, and it had a book that accompanied it, The Key to the Tarot. Not the pictorial key to the tarot that often comes with Waite-Smith decks now. There weren't pictures in it at first. Although a year later, it was published as the pictorial key to the tarot. And that little white booklet that we often get in our decks of cards now became the common partner to the Waite-Smith deck. That first printing of the Waite-Smith deck was simply referred to as tarot cards. It didn't have a particular name yet. I think the name started being applied to it as we know it now when U.S. Games bought the rights to publication of the deck in 1971. When they first published it in 1971, they referred to it as the Rider Tarot deck. Rider was the publisher to the first versions of the deck. U.S. Games later changed the naming of it to the Rider Tarot, and then finally it settled down into the Rider Waite Tarot. And today we tend to, in community, refer to it as the Waite-Smith Tarot. That publisher that handled it originally has a lot less meaning to us now than the names of Waite and Smith. It can be confusing to those of us who first begin to study the Waite-Smith deck that there are so many versions of it. We come to know that color plays a very important part in interpretation of the symbols of the card. Colors were applied for a specific reason, and yet colors can be different version to version of this Waite-Smith deck. It has to do with quality of the card stock, it has to do with the ink used, it has to do with design decisions made. But it can be different, card to card. Nothing more frustrating when we're studying, and it advises us that, for instance, white means a certain thing on a card. And we look at the card, and what it's referring to as white is not white on our card, even though we have a Waite-Smith deck. So it doesn't hurt to know a little bit about these different variations of the deck that were created over time. Those decks also vary according to the quality of the line drawings, how thick or thin the lines were, how defined they are. So it's the quality of the printing that will sometimes enter into it. Whether the lines are thick or thin, the clarity of them, it allows you to see things like, say, the expressions on the characters' faces varies. Not only from version of the deck to version of the deck, but each version of the deck, as it is printed over time, might be printed differently and a different quality. U.S. Games was not interested in creating an art piece. They were creating a novelty piece. So consistency and matching the artwork wasn't a priority for them. And except, really, as far as I'm concerned, with the exception of perhaps one contemporary manufacturer of replicas of the cards, the colors and the fine ink and detailed printing, even the quality of the cardstock, isn't necessarily been the most important thing that they've had in mind. Let's do a little journey through the cards. You're going to find they'll be narrating some of this video, and in fact some of the videos that we will do going forward, in which case there'll be a picture on the screen instead of my mug, and it'll be me talking. Because it's not about my mug, it's about the images on the cards for a lot of the discussions we are about to have. So you'll see that video switch over to more of an audio aligned to a picture in a bit. About the cards, let me tell you about some categories the way I look at it. There is the original line drawings and the original color. There are original line drawings that have been recolored, so the colors don't necessarily match the original. And there are redrawings. Some of those redrawings are very close to the original drawings that Pamela did for the deck, but there may be differences in thickness or thinness of the ink, which shifts how the image looks, the energy of the image, the shadings of images might be different. So there are redrawings. So you have the original drawings and coloring. You have the original drawings with new coloring. You have imitations of the original drawings that may or may not have the original coloring or new coloring. And then, of course, you have the decks that grew out of that over time, where the card may be kept intact to a great degree as far as the images and the symbolism, but it's been redrawn. It can take on a very different personality, and don't get me wrong, I have nothing against those redrawings. A lot of them move and inspire me. I'm going to do a separate video on those clones of the Waite-Smith deck that I enjoy. So I want to share, before I get into the specifics of some of the decks I'm about to share with you, I'm like most of you, I'm a casual researcher. I read a lot. I have a lot of books on the tarot that I've been studying over the past year, a lot of them with a lot of good information. Information on the history of the tarot, not only its older histories from centuries ago, but contemporary history, relatively recently, since the publishings in the 1900s, vary. I'm not one who's going to know that the things I'm sharing with you are exact when it comes to dates. Even sources that I trust have revised their dates and considerations as it's gone forward. It's always a fluid study when it comes to the tarot. So I'm going to switch over, for the time being, to audio with a picture for you, as I share some of the things that fascinated me about the journey through the Waite-Smith deck over time, beginning in its publication in 1910. There were at least 4, probably more, but 4 versions of the earliest cards that were published by writer or writer and son. We commonly refer to them as Pamela A, B, C, and D. The interesting thing, though, is they didn't necessarily come out in that order. What's in front of you now is Pamela A. These were printed from 1910 to 1920, so more than likely, if history is correct, the first deck to be published. Notice they have a lighter color, almost pastel in nature, and there's a fine detail to the lines. The next version is Pamela C, published from 1920 to 1928. And this is Pamela D, published from 1920 to 1931. And finally, Pamela B, published in 1931 to 1941. And here's the interesting thing about Pamela B. Published much later than Pamela A. But there is some thought in tarot circles that it is actually the earliest design, meaning the drawing in the ink is probably much closer to the original artwork. It might seem interesting to consider that we don't seem to know what the original artwork or coloring was like. That is because Pamela's original designs, the plates for the drawings and colors that were used for the disputed first version of the Waite-Smith deck, were lost in the bombings of the Blitz of London in World War II. The drawings themselves, the black and white drawings, existed, even though the colored plates were destroyed. That is because the black and white drawings used to illustrate the pictorial key to the tarot were stored elsewhere and not destroyed when the plates were destroyed. So there is some thought that this Pamela D, the one you're looking at now, is closest to the original coloring. It seems to be the one that they borrowed from when they published the Centennial deck, honoring 100 years of the Waite-Smith deck. All of the decks do have in common the crackled brown back. And you'll note that when I share anything about the tarot cards, I always include their back. And in fact, the back is often one of the easiest ways to determine what version of the card you have in hand. Remember, it's not, as time went by, so much about the date that something was published, but it is about all the different times it was published under that same copyright. The back will give you an indication what version of the card you have. Although more than likely, you do not have a version with the crackled back design. All of us who love tarot always have this dream that there will be a garage sale, a used furniture or collectibles sale, and somewhere in that sale will pop up an intact deck, all 78 cards of the original printings. Very rare to come by nowadays and very expensive. So why does it make any difference, these 4 early printings of the deck? This image combines all 4 of the Pamela A, B, C, and D cards for you to look at. Well, it might not seem to be a big difference card to card. There are variations in the quality of the printing, the colors applied to the plate, the thin or thick degree of the line drawings, all which make variations in the design. In these early cards, we don't see a variety of colors because only a few colors were actually available to be used in the printing process at that time. The earliest publication of the deck came with the key to the tarot. And then by the second printing, the pictorial key to the tarot was included in the packs. That pictorial key to the tarot is well known to any of us who buy a Waite-Smith deck because it's almost always included. It's also available free on many online sources. Skipping forward now, we come to 1971, when U.S. Games began printing the deck. The first one they printed they called the Rider-Waite Tarot. They actually didn't yet have the copyright on them. They're out of print now. They had more pastel coloring than later decks, even issued by U.S. Games, even the later deck from the same year. The lines are more defined. Character of the faces, shading, could all be seen better. The coloring seems aligned to that Pamela A version from 1910. We can see that in the clarity of the blue in the mountains behind the Fool. This was the original deck I had, which is why to this very day I prefer the more pastel shadings to the deck. Oh, how I wish I still had that deck. Also in 1971 came out the copyrighted printing, this time around referred to as the Rider Tarot. It's probably the most commonly seen of the decks more garish colors, bright colors, and in fact, the colors were so bright in some of the printings that it obscured the line drawings themselves. Some of the clarity disappeared. And oh, the backs to the 1971 decks. Ugly as could be. Someone on our Facebook said, "These backs can make you dizzy just looking at them." There is a rather dramatic difference in those two printings of the deck. The second one, the most bold, well, I consider it garish, coloration, is the one that is the most commonly sold deck today. In 1990, US Games came out with the Universal Waite deck. Thinner lines, colored with pencil, allowing for finer shading. But to me, details seem to be missing off the card. The faces definitely feel different to me. It's not a bad thing, it's just a different thing from those earlier cards. Mary Hanson Roberts colored these cards. Therefore, those colorations reflect her interpretation of the color. They use the same line drawings from the 1971 deck. They're recolored, though, with variations in the thickness of the lines. Universal Waite has beautiful starred backs. In 1991, the Albano White cards came out. Again, recolored versions of the 1971 deck using the same artwork. This artwork, though, copied more precisely than the Universal Waite, sticking more closely at least to the 1971 Rider Waite deck. Going back again to the slightly thicker lines, but with some brighter coloring over the originals. Sometimes the coloring's very bright, and the color shifted a little bit. I like the look of these cards on the front, but I don't like them because here's the back. And I may have mentioned earlier, I'm picky about backs. I use reversals. I don't want a deck back that I can look at and know whether the card's upright or not. And this beautiful sunburst on the back of the Albano Whites definitely gives you an impression of an up and down nature to the cards. In 1996, the Golden Rider Tarot came out. This deck's actually one of my favorites. I don't have it. Too expensive. Who knows, maybe someday I'll be lucky and find it. But I have friends that have it. The colors are brighter and more distinct because the originals were oil paint. The colors feel warm to me, but they still feel linked to the original colors. They have a very interesting card back, the petaled background. In 2003, the Radiant Rider Waite came out. Very bright colors, but not as much variation in shading, and for some reason a heavy use of the color purple. The facial expressions aren't caught the same way, even though it's a redrawing of the original artwork. It feels different. It has a beautiful starred background on the cards. And then in 2009, the Pamela Coleman Smith commemorative deck came out, celebrating the 100th birthday. It's based on a 1909 deck that was in private collection. It looks like it's a reproduction of the Pamela A. The lines are not as fine due to the not so wonderful quality of the US Games cards. And my problem with the deck, beautiful as it is they decided they were going to artificially age the cards, trying to make them look like they were old, instead of trying to colorize them to match the original colors. Well, perhaps they couldn't figure out what the original colors were because they had that old deck in hand to copy from. So the colors are dim, but the colors are fairly true, it would seem, to the Pamela A which is probably my favorite of all of the versions of the cards. It's got a beautiful rose back with Pamela's signature as part of it. The only complaints I have about this beautiful deck, other than the artificial browning of the cards, is that the back, the rose design is such that you can tell whether a card is facing up or down. Also, Liscarabaco brought out a reproduction of the Rider-Waite Tarot. They called it the Centenary Special Rider-Waite Tarot. I've actually just gifted myself with that. I have it on order. What I like about this is that the coloration is so similar to my favorite earlier versions of the cards. I couldn't find a copy of the Fool to share with you, so instead I'm sharing a copy of the Magician card. It has the rose and lily back. I truly love this deck. I can't wait for it to arrive so I can see if it is as beautiful in person as it is in the pictures I've seen online. And then in 2012, the original Rider-Waite Tarot pack was brought out. That's the deck I'm actually currently using myself. Had the rose and lily background, thicker lines, but close to original colors. The strange thing is the lack of blue in the coloration. What was blue in the older colorations is now green in this one. And there are some details on this deck which don't appear in some of the in-between versions. While the colors are less saturated, it could be that, once again, it's been given a brownish hue, probably to make it look aged, but in the end it dims down the colors. I am particularly fond of this particular deck. Like I said, it's the one I currently use, although I think I'll probably be tempted to switch over to Liscarabaco's Centenary Special Rider-Waite Tarot when it comes in. So there we go, a little bit of a tour through the re-editions of the Waite-Smith Tarot deck, in great part true to the original drawings, with shiftings in the line art and shiftings in the coloring. So there you have it, my little tour through the versions of this Waite-Smith deck, which were true to the original drawings, although with variations in the thickness of the lines and the variations in the coloring. Which one of those decks do you have in your Waite-Smith collection? All of them are going to work just fine with the videos I'll upload on the individual cards as we go along. And in fact, any clone of the Rider-Waite is going to work just fine for you. I'm going to do a separate video on the Rider-Waite clones, sharing my thoughts on them and sharing some of my favorite ones, because I do have some favorite ones. Your comments on what I have shared are welcome below or on our Facebook group, and as always, information on that is at the end of this video and below. Don't hesitate to correct me. Like I said, I'm just, like so many of us, reading and intrigued by what I read and seeing varying opinions regarding just about everything that has to do with the tarot. So I'm very easily corrected if I've misspoken. Mary Part.